time I'm going to dispense with the introduction about my background and everything. Most of you probably have been into set in on trainings in the past and have kind of heard it before. So maybe this time I'll skip it here. And so thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. So what we're going to talk about, last time we talked about a lot of the research on foster care outcomes, and that's a big subject and we didn't cover all of it, but a lot of it we did. But today I want to do something a little bit different and talk about practices within child welfare that can make foster care a better experience and a less damaging experience, both things, more positive, less negative, that kind of thing. And just as a preface to, and by the way, at any point that you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can do that in the chat. You can just break in, you can do that. You don't have to wait for me to stop. So, of course, the children that you're representing in court, those are dependency actions, court orders, probably guessing here, almost all, maybe not all, but most all of those kids were removed from the home through some kind of emergency action, either through a court order or through a law enforcement agency. And, so for the most part, those were probably emergency placements. And the justification for those was that a child's immediate safety was threatened. And so the grounds for emergency removal was risk of imminent harm. And so obviously a very strong focus here on preserving, in many instances, literally the lives of young children, but also to protect them in the very immediate future. And so that leads a lot of times child welfare systems and everyone who works with child welfare systems to be very focused on child safety as being sort of certainly the primary goal of child protection, but also in some instances almost the only goal. And so what I want to kind of get across here in the next 45 minutes to an hour is the idea that once kids are in foster care for more than a few days, and there are some kids who are in foster care only a few days, and a lot of, and at least in past years, that was a surprisingly large number. I don't know what it is today. It used to be, for example, when I worked for the child welfare system in this state in the early 2000s, about a fifth of all placements ended within a week. I don't know what that is today. Maybe that's less. Maybe there are less brief placements than there used to be. But of the placements that go on then, after a few days, I guess the first idea I want to get across is that everyone who works with kids has to be concerned with their well-being as well as their safety. So after kids have been in care for just a few days, child welfare systems are on the hook for not just for the well-being of kids. And that has, of course, that's a multidimensional kind of a concept there. And so think about what well-being means for your kids, your grandkids, your relative, people you know. So well-being has a multidimensional focus, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. So one of the first things we want to think about is that once kids are in the child welfare system, and particularly kids who've been in place there emergently, as would be the case, to say this again, probably for most of the kids that you're representing, then when at all possible, we want moves to be planned. That is, once kids enter the child welfare system, the idea should be no more emergency moves. No more foster parent calling up a caseworker and saying, get this kid out tomorrow or something like that. So that's the kind of thing that we want to head off at the pass, because there's going to be situations where kids really do have to be moved for all kind of different reasons that you're probably already familiar with. Kids are moving from what amounts to a short-term receiving home type placements into a foster home. They're moving from a foster home into an adoptive home. Sometimes they're moving from a foster care placement because the foster parents couldn't handle the situation or didn't want to, or maybe they're getting divorced, or all kind of things happen. But whenever those kind of things happen, we want the move to be planned. And so in order for that to happen, both caseworkers, all of you, the courts, everyone who interacts with foster parents needs to reiterate this theme from the very first. not waiting until the foster parent initiates something like that. We want to be talking to foster parents ahead of time about whatever happens here, we don't want any emergency moves. And so if a foster parent really does intend that, just doesn't believe a situation with a child is going to work out, then we need to be able to call a meeting. We need to be able to get the caseworker together with you and with sometimes with family members, and we need to just have a discussion about what's the next best step, right? Instead of this, come and get the kid and place the child somewhere tomorrow, right? So one of the things we want to do is we want to adopt the sort of the same principle that supposedly medicine adopts, which is at least do no harm. I mean, so we don't want to be doing things in child welfare that we already know actively harm kids. And one of those things is emergency moves. So insofar, sometimes you've probably heard the assertion that all foster care placements are traumatic. That's not true, but a lot of them are traumatic. And the ones that are traumatic, they're traumatic partly because the moves are emergency moves. I mean, someone just shows up and removes you. I mean, how would you feel about that? I mean, so we want to stop that. Okay, part of what planning means is that we also want to have whenever possible a period of transition. So that's part of what a planning meeting would be about. It would be about a transition plan. So if we're moving a child from foster home A to foster home B, we want, if at all possible, we want the opportunity there for the child to have, particularly school-aged kids, we want the opportunity for kids to have visited the foster home at least once and sometimes more than once before we make the move. Now, obviously, this isn't always possible, but this ought to be the sort of the idea, the thing that we're aiming for here. Is we want moves to be thoughtful, we want them to be planned, we want them to be gradual whenever possible. And so to the extent that we can do that. So let's just, before I go any further, let me stop and see if you have comments or questions about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say in the chat, I put together, this is from one of the trainings that we've done before, but an FTDM transition planning guide so that people can take those to a meeting and just know what questions they need to be asking of all of the people there to talk about kind of exactly what you're talking about. How do we make this a transition instead of just let's go pick the kid up and drop them off somewhere else? So.
Okay. And then, of course, there needs to be some thinking there about, well, why are we making the move? I mean, and lots of times it's as simple as that a foster parent's demanding it. That would probably be the most common reason. Sometimes it's because a foster child is actually moving into hopefully an adoptive home. That would be another reason, right? But I've encountered situations where caseworkers are just moving kids because it's more convenient for them to have child in home A rather than home B. That is, and even when child is doing well in one home, maybe a caseworker believes that, a move would be warranted because maybe you could do more visits. You might have a child in some other county or something, and now there's a foster home is opened up in the county where the child's family lives. And so there might be, that's a defensible kind of a rationale for a move a lot of the time. But again, there needs to be a get together and discuss that kind of thing. Because for some children, moves are really, really impactful, much more impactful than they are for other children. So there needs to be some discussion here, particularly when these moves are optional. That is, when there's a real choice here, there needs to be some discussion about, well, is this really the wisest, most prudent thing to be doing in this situation? Not generally speaking in terms of principles or anything like that, but in this situation, given this child, their needs, their background, their history, and so forth, right? Is that the wisest thing to be doing there? So let me stop there and see if you have comments or questions here. Okay, so just a few other kind of thoughts here. that is particularly around a lot of times when kids are moved, and particularly when they're moved out of situations with siblings, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to place the siblings together. I mean, I don't know how it is now, but when I was in child welfare, it was often a situation where we could place two kids together. Often there'd be a couple of younger kids, but if there were 3 or 4 kids, and almost invariably the kids had to be separated. And so one of the things we want to think about here whenever we're moving kids around is, well, what is it going to take to preserve sibling connections here? And if there is anything, any theme that research in the last 20 years has underlined and re-underlined, it's the importance of sibling connections across the lifespan. I want to say this again, the importance of sibling connections across the lifespan. So it isn't just a matter that kids may already have a sibling connection, which is very, very important to them, but also that they prospectively can have a sibling connection that lasts their entire lives. And so whatever we can do to strengthen that, and of course, there are going to be some extreme situations where siblings do have to be separated just because of some untenable conflict, or there can be situations where one sibling is sexually abusing another. All those kind of things can happen. But as far as the sort of the general principle here, we want, in most instances, we want to be doing whatever it takes to preserve sibling connections. Well, of course, that's really a lot easier to do if there are 2 foster homes that have, let's say there are 3 kids and 2 of them are in one home and another one's in another home. It's much easier to preserve those connections if those 2 foster parents are talking. That is, if there has to be an intermediary there, if it always has to be a caseworker or something like that, who's negotiating or, acts as a mediator or something like that, that makes it very hard to maintain connections could do that for a while, but it makes it hard to do it over the long run. So it's very, very helpful to have the foster parents in those situations meet at least once, and in some kind of comfortable kind of setting, and they being functional people, hopefully they can work this situation out. I mean, it doesn't have to be prescribed by a caseworker or a court or anything like that. They can just work it out in a way that, and of course there's no rule there as to how much visit sibling contact is the best. I mean, that's kind of variable with kids and with their ages and so forth, but there really ought to be some conscious effort made there and some really thoughtful effort made in. And whenever it is that for whatever reason siblings have had to be separated for some period of time, then maybe that's necessary for some reason or other. We don't want to forget about the sibling connection thing. I mean, it's something that all of us should want to come back to at a point in time and revisit the issue when perhaps it's easier to make all of that stuff happen. So let me stop here and see if you have a comment or question here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the issue of visits. Visits with, sometimes it's parents in the plural, sometimes it's a single parent, sometimes it's, of course, that parents are separated or divorced, or maybe they were never married in the first place. So you have to set up visits independently and separately, and and so again, the idea should be here to work something out that's as comfortable as possible for all parties, that involves the minimum of caseworker interference in it all. So here's the absolutely worst situation is when for very long periods of time, you have to have visits in an office in some kind of controlled setting. Someone from the office has to come out and drive the kid to the visit. You may even have a situation where a child is living out of county and someone has to drive 30, 40 miles away to get the kid, bring the kid back to an office. That's just very untenable over a long period of time. And in those situations, over time, visits gradually, for obvious practical reasons, tend to be more infrequent. So what we ought to be, at least aiming for in most situations is that we want visits to be comfortable. And we also want them to be the kind of thing that can be arranged, if at all possible, between a birth parent or birth parents, and a foster parent or foster parents. So again, this is a situation that sometimes can work, sometimes it doesn't work. Some foster parents don't want any contact with birth parents at all, and they can't be talked into it. And that's their right as a volunteer. You know, we can't twist their arm and make them do it. On the other hand, there have always been foster parents within the state systems that have discovered over the years that that for the most part, birth parents aren't really bad people. They aren't really evil people. They're not dangerous for the most part. Occasionally they are, but a lot, you know, very, very frequently they aren't. So lots of foster parents have worked it out on their own without caseworkers ever being interfering in any kind of way, that they have been able to develop relationships with the birth parent. And that's the kind of thing that we want to be encouraging when it's possible for that to happen. Because when that does happen, then the visitation is always going to be easier. It's always going to be more frequent. When foster parents and birth parents have a decent relationship, they can talk. They don't have to be separated at all times. There doesn't have to be an intermediary or someone arranging visits and doing the transporting and all the stuff that makes visitation difficult. You know, you just sort of leap over all those obstacles when foster parents and birth parents can have a good, reasonable, decent kind of a relationship there. And again, there have been programs in the state at some point in the past. They were called Fostering Connections. I don't know what they're called now. And I don't even know the status of those programs at this point in time. But there used to be those kind of programs around the state. And I would guess that they probably are some of them now. And generally, I would say that most of the foster parents who have been engaged in those kind of practices, for the most part, they're experienced people. They've been around for some time. They've kind of learned through trial and error what kind of works for them. They're not crazy. They're not, you know, they're not just going to leap into something based on faith. I mean, a lot of times they're going to want to meet the parents maybe at an office. They're going to want to gradually develop a relationship with the parent over time. Of course, they're going to want to be assured of their own safety and that this is going to be a workable kind of a deal. And some foster parents have always been able to do that. And there are others that probably have never even heard of the idea because maybe it's never been even brought up in foster parent training, or maybe it's never even been broached at a meeting or something, perhaps. You know, I don't know. You know, some of you have probably been to the family team meetings. I haven't been to one of those meetings in many, many years. So I don't know what kind of subjects are discussed there. But anyway, that would be the ideal kind of arrangement. And so there have been in recent years, occasionally Annie E. Casey Foundation. I think you probably are aware of that. Not the same as Casey Family Programs, which of course has offices in Seattle. And at one point, you know, you probably heard me say, I worked for Casey Family Programs in this state for 6 years. But Annie Casey is in Baltimore and probably has had more influence on child welfare policy, kind of behind the scenes influence in the last 20, 25 years than any other advocacy group, any other foundation, anyone outside of government. Probably Annie Casey has had more influence. Well, so they have tried in the last several years to develop kind of model requirements for foster parents that would basically, it would mandate foster parents to do what I just said, to work with birth parents. I don't think that's workable. I don't agree with that. I don't think foster parents should be mandated, you know, to do something like that unless they are professional foster parents, and that's different. But assuming that they're volunteer foster parents, then I think they have to have the choice and it has to be up to them. But ideally, that would be what we would be aiming for. So let me stop here and see if you have comments or questions here. Okay. So part of what makes, insofar as foster care is problematic, and I talked about last time, particularly issues related to behaviorally troubled kids, and because a lot of the a lot of the moves, the emergency moves that I talked about before happen with behaviorally troubled kids, and because they're either their oppositional behavior or even more likely their meltdown behavior. If they have trauma histories, then they may be liable to meltdowns. And a lot of foster parents don't come to foster parenting with any knowledge of that or what to do about that kind of situation where maybe a 5 or 6 year old child is having tantrums, which are just in violent, difficult to manage, scary, actually. Right. So what we want to think about here then is before there is an emergency, before there is a situation where foster parent A is ready just to give up on a kid, and particularly if kids have behavior problems and have these emotion regulation problems that I just mentioned, we want to be thinking about, well, what can be done to minimize the possibility that this situation is going to blow to smithereens. In other words, instead of waiting for a crisis to happen, we need to think about proactively in terms of a prevention kind of thing. What can we do to make this situation more manageable for the foster parents, particularly if they're kind of new at the whole thing and haven't had a lot of experience with dealing with behaviorally troubled kids? And so again, the value of a planning meeting here around, well, what can be done to make this work? And some of these things are very common sensey kind of things, right? And I only bring it up because it has kind of been a discovery to me over the years that many of the things that I think almost all of us would think would be common sense things and that would routinely happen when a child is in foster care, for example, a medical exam. There have been quite a few studies that show that lots of kids just don't get very good medical care in foster care. They don't necessarily, if they're not sick, they don't necessarily have a medical exam. Well, that's just something that just should never happen. But of course, it does happen from time to time. So the same thing goes with issues around how to make sort of foster placements with behaviorally troubled kids, how to make arrangements that increase the probability that they're going to survive and last, right? And so one of those ideas that I think must have occurred to probably all of you at some point is that the foster parents will need respite care from time to time. And the more behaviorally troubled a child is, the more likely that they will need respite care on demand, not just a guaranteed amount of respite care every month, like a day or two when someone else takes care of the child, but in some crisis situations they're going to need more than that. They're going to need to be able to call someone and get some kind of immediate kind of help. Well, that's the kind of thing that you just can't arrange that on the spur of the moment. That's not going to work out great. There has to be some kind of hopefully some planning, some thinking about how to set up respite care. And at least if emergency respite care is needed, well, how would the foster parents take advantage of that, or how would they access that ahead of time, rather than getting into a desperate kind of a situation where they feel they just can't cope and they just have to stop being the foster parents for this particular child there. If foster parents have a behaviorally troubled kid, usually they are going to need either a therapist or a psychiatric consultant who is going to call them back within an hour. So talking about emergency response, if kids are having a meltdown or if something has happened that the foster parent just has no idea how to cope with this or what even to make of the behavior or make of the situation, then a foster parent of a behaviorally troubled kid is going to need to be able to reach out to someone. And this is why a lot of those foster parents, of course, work with private agencies who presumably That's part of what hopefully we're paying private agencies for, to offer that kind of consultation on an as-need kind of basis. But of course, there are always some foster parents who aren't connected to private agencies. And particularly for those foster parents, then ahead of time, again, we need to make sure that they have access to emergency consultation as needed. So from Shelley, do you have any tips to make this? You want to say more, Shelley, about that? Do you have any tips to make this happen? Other than getting together with everyone involved at a family team meeting and just having a discussion about this. And of course, it is sometimes that foster parents sometimes will have their own resources, right? But a lot of times, in order to use those resources in a comfortable way, they're going to need funding. They're going to need some kind of assurance that they're not going to have to bear all the expense of that. And so that's another reason that, we want there should be some kind of assurances from the agency ahead of time that if a foster parent needs emergency consultation, the agency is going to pay for that.
If the child needs to have a counselor, therapist, whatever you would like to call them, on demand, how does the team find such a person?
Yeah. So
most of them, 5:00 on Friday, they're off.
Well, yeah, and of course, I don't have any great answer to this other than, and obviously it's going to be different in the various communities where you live. I mean, I was a regional administrator in Region 6 with those little communities where there probably wouldn't be any resource like that in some of the communities at all. But in some places, like I live now in Tacoma, Seattle, Olympia, there are probably places like that. Now, when I'm talking about when a foster parent needs immediate access to a therapist, that doesn't mean that a therapist is going to come to their home. It
Right.
doesn't mean that a therapist is going to necessarily interact with the child or provide therapy, but they're going to consult with the foster parent on an as-need kind of a basis there. Now, that's what I mean about the emergency consultation. But some kids, you're right, are going to need the emergency. Actually, sometimes kids are going to need to be admitted to a psychiatric facility. I mean, all of that stuff is true. And it kind of depends, again, on whatever is the resource that the community has there. So the great advantage now, one of the things that as causes that I would offer here is that if you're dealing with kids who have a history of really being kind of moved from home to home, and you have a child who's had this kind of a history, then a lot of times it would be so prudent and wise of foster parents actually to connect themselves to a private agency. So in other words, there's going to be someone whose job it is to support them in this situation, so that they don't have to create all of these relationships on an ad hoc basis. Some of the foster parents obviously don't want to do this, because what happens is that the foster parent then, that is, the private agency takes a lot of the reimbursement. That is, so one of the reasons that a lot of times foster parents who are dealing with behaviorally troubled kids will try to do it on their own is because, of course, they're trying to optimize the amount of reimbursement that they're getting instead of most of that going to the private agency. But nevertheless, if kids have a really, really long history of being moved from placement to placement, then it is so imprudent, so unwise for foster parents to take on a child like that unless they are connected to a private agency or themselves are kind of a private agency of sorts, so that you have that kind of support. There is an underlying issue, which of course is implicit in all this is a state which for decades has underfunded its mental health systems, both adult and juvenile, right? And so you end up with this is kind of a karmic kind of a consequence, because once you've done this over a long, long period of time, just because a legislature steps up to the plate in a single session and provides a few $100 million for mental health services, it doesn't mean that, communities can just go and instantaneously create all those resources. So one of the things you find out about public policy is it really takes not just funding, it takes a decade or two to make that funding work out well. So there have to be persistent efforts to do this. And that's why in lots of communities, one of the things that we hope that very competent, child welfare managers will do is that they will bring people together in the community to try to create, sometimes when there's even funding for this, you can't find a resource. So you need to be able to bring people together in order to create the mental health resources that you're going to need there. Now, just a few other things that I do want to mention here, just because sometimes we just, particularly in the smaller communities, just don't have those kind of resources, right? And so I think I've mentioned before in these trainings that every foster parent in this state should be able, ahead of time, not waiting for an emergency, that they should be able to read the Deborah Gray book, Nurturing Adoptions, or some other book on the subject of trauma-informed care, particularly around the issue of how does one who's caring for a child liable to meltdowns, how does one deal with that situation, right? How do you actually calm a child down who's freaking out? Whether that child is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, or older there, right? And so there is really excellent, really super good resources on this particular issue now. That didn't used to be the case when I worked for the child welfare system, but it is true now. Those kind of research. And last time, after the presentation that I did last time, I sent around a list of resources, and which was there, and that's just a fraction of the resources that are out there around that particular. And really, the concrete thing, and just to go back to this for a second, the thing that really causes placements to disrupt a lot of the times is because kids will have one of these meltdowns, and foster parents are just clueless as to what to do about it. And that is assuming that they don't do something very stupid and dumb or hurtful and harmful in response to such behavior. So every parent, and not just the foster parents who deal with behaviorally troubled kids, every foster parent, as far as foster parent training, ought to be put in contact with those resources. And here we're talking about books and podcasts and articles. Used to be you had to read books. You don't really have to do that anymore. I mean, there are all kind of ways of getting that kind of information there, particularly around how to help kids who have these affect regulation kind of problems there. And a lot of the kids who have very serious trauma histories are going to have those kind of problems. That used to be a major reason why kids went from foster care to residential care. Right there, because the underlying idea was that the foster parents couldn't handle that kind of situation, but the residential care facilities could. But it just turns out that a lot of the residential care facilities couldn't handle that kind of situation. They themselves did not have the expertise. And that's one of the reasons that there had been, as I mentioned before, really scandalous, horrible things happen in some residential care facilities in this state over the last 3 or 4 decades. I mean, why has residential care so often got such a bad reputation? Because a lot of times they didn't have the expertise to deal with this, and they did really hurtful, punitive, wrong, bad things. So particularly, let me just stay on this subject here for just a second. Let's say that you are a guardian ad litem or a CASA for a child who has this kind of issue with affect regulation, and maybe this child has been moved around a lot and is on meds and so forth. And so you ought to know ahead of time that that is a child who's very much at risk in the foster care system. I mean, you ought to have that kind of mindset. And so that is a child who needs more of your attention. And now here we're talking about even how to assure child safety here. Someone has got to stay until this isn't a sort of a matter of applying a policy where someone visits a child on a monthly basis or something like that. We're talking about some kids who are liable to these kind of difficulties who need to be visited much more regularly. And so that is one of the primary benefits, I think, of having CASAs or guardian ad litems with a lot of kids who've been in foster care for a long time and they're subject to these kind of difficulties, is that the caseworkers may change a lot for all kind of different reasons. But sometimes there's a consistent CASA there over a long period of time who has a personal relationship with the youth or the child. And so that is another thing about how to increase the possibility that foster care is going to be a beneficial experience as opposed to a harmful experience, someone needs to have that kind of relationship with a child over a long period of time. And so this isn't a matter of a caseworker going out and making a safety visit on a monthly basis and using a checklist and asking kids some kind of questions that are on a form or something. That's not what I mean. I mean, actually having a relationship in the same way that you might have a relationship with a family member, with a child that you've known over a long period of time, that you can actually talk with, and the child trusts you enough to tell you what's going on, and particularly if they don't feel safe being able to tell you that. So particularly when you talk about kids who are in the school age range, and I said last time, so let me say this again, where foster care systems have been historically in this country and elsewhere in the world very underperforming is with school age kids who have behavioral difficulties, real serious behavior difficulties. And those are the kids who need the protection within the foster care system the most. And as well as protection, and I mean a focus on their safety, but I also mean an interest in their well-being. An interest in their well-being. And of course, part of that issue with kids who are school age is the issue of, well, how are they doing in school? Because kids in this country, in this society, it's still the case that if kids cannot negotiate the school system, they are really going to have a lot of trouble in adolescence and in young adulthood, as well as usually in the rest of their lives there. So, of course, how kids are doing and adjusting in school, that is really a big deal. And so everyone who's a CASA and everyone who's a guardian ad litem and caseworkers all need to be very, very attuned to this issue. And sometimes that, that's why schools have these meetings, whatever there's a lingo to that I've forgotten, but, probably some of you have attended meetings of that sort within school systems. So we want to do, again, whatever is possible to help kids to adjust to the school system. And part of that means, again, being able to manage their emotions. I mean, that you're not going to be able to make it in a school system if they flip out and attack peers. That's a way out of the school system. But even if kids have emotion regulation, a lot of times they're going to have difficulty with the work. I mean, with the academic work, and they are going to need help with tutoring and with other kind of intensive kind of programs and assistance there. So being very attentive and attuned to that issue with school age kids, that's a really super, super important thing. I mentioned last time, and I want to say this again, that one of the things, a lot of kids who have had very serious difficulties with child maltreatment in early childhood and later, and been subject to multiple types of trauma, and maybe have been harmed in foster care through, moves in the way we've talked about here and so forth. In order for those children to have some chance of thriving in life, they're going to really need to discover a talent. And I mean a pro-social talent that's going to bring them recognition, because again, if you're failing in school, then that is really, really a difficult thing, to maintain any kind of self-esteem or feeling of being valued. It's very, very hard if kids cannot negotiate the school system. And in order to do that, a lot of times they're going to need something else that they're good at. And so one of the things we've got to be doing for kids who are in foster care for longer than, if they've been in foster care for longer than 90 days, we ought to be really thinking about, well, how do we identify an interest, a talent, something that we can assist this child with? And so that might be music, it might be drama, it might be art of some type, it might be computer games, it might be agriculture, cooking, whatever is the idea here is any kind of skill set, because it does need to be a skill set, something that a child can get better at doing that's going to bring that child pro-social recognition, not just in their childhood, in their adolescence, and in their adult life, hopefully. And so again, some of the most inspiring kind of stuff, in movies and documentaries that I've seen over the last 20 years are those kind of situations where schools or community entities and so forth have created situations where kids who are really having difficulty in school are able to thrive and achieve for themselves positive recognition. So the documentary Mad Hot Ballroom, which came out about 15 years ago, some of you may have seen that. And if you haven't, I recommend it. My guess is you can probably find it online. It's about a bunch of middle school kids in New York City in low-income neighborhoods who were entered into a ballroom dancing contest over a period of months. And it shows how these kids many of them just flower and bloom under that situation because the school personnel are so into it. They're so motivated to have those kids do well, and they're so invested in it. And of course, the kids pick up on that. So of course, that's why lots of kids who have trouble in school in this country, particularly, that's so incredibly, in love with athletics. I mean, a lot of times kids in school who are good at football or good at soccer, or good at something there, that again, the people around them really care about that. And of course, the kids pick up on that. So after children, particularly school-age kids, are in care a few months, then we ought to be investing for that. Now, something that I've proposed over the years, and people always say, oh, what a great idea, but of course they never do it. But the idea here is that if we could get a philanthropist in this state or some other state to put up, anywhere from $100,000 to $250,000 a year, which for some of these people would be nothing. It'd be like buying a latte, so the idea then we would give $5,000 grants a year to about 20 kids in the foster care system a year, have a contest around, we're going to invest some money in you to develop your talents. And we want to see some indication of interest and talent as basis for investing in you. So we have a contest and we hand out anywhere from $100,000 to $250,000 a year. And then we have an award ceremony, and just to be able to do some of that kind of stuff that happens for lots of middle and upper middle class kids in this country on kind of a routine basis. So again, let me kind of stop there and see if you have comments or questions here. Okay, so I want to go back to a couple of the time we've got left, just to a couple of the basics here. When kids come in foster care, and if they're there for longer than 30 days, I mean, there used to be something called a CHET screen. So is that still being done? If the CHET screening is still being done. Okay, so that is going to look at the developmental status of children who are coming into the foster care system. So one of the things we want foster care systems to do is to take care of kids' needs of that sort. Because again, one of the effects of maltreatment is going to be to cause developmental impairments. And so we want to identify those developmental impairments, and sometimes this can also be true of foster care. Foster care can cause developmental impairments. When that happens, then we want kids to receive services as soon as possible. So the idea would be as early as possible for whatever and that developmental impairment can be issues related to behavior problems, but it could also be something physical. And a lot of times it is something physical related either to motor development or to, a whole range. And a lot of times with kids who have emotional issues, it's going to be issues related to social skills. So, I mean, a lot of times you're going to end up with kids who just don't have friends, and it's such a sad situation. I mean, in the sort of the 6 to 10 or 11-year-old age range, when kids should be hanging out with their friends, and yet a kid, because of their obnoxious behavior, or maybe they just don't know how to interact with other kids. So again, addressing stuff like that as early as possible in the development of children, rather than waiting until it becomes a really major league issue in the child's life there. I've already mentioned the issue around physical problems, and I come back to this just because of the finding in a number of studies is that some kids are just not getting basic medical care in foster care. And so there have been recent studies, for example, in Oregon within the last 5 or 6 years, the state of Oregon did a kind of a large scale look at the physical health problems of kids in the Oregon foster care system. And the findings there are really just totally shocking. I mean, I've sent some of these findings out from time to time in commentaries or articles or so forth, and I can do it again, but you just need to look at the list of, I mean, the number of kids who have these issues, and from a very young age. I mean, issues ranging from everything like asthma, I mean, very high rates of that, all kind of other kind of disabilities. I mean, so, and being able to, again, to make sure that particularly when we have disabled kids in the foster care system, that again, an elevated rate of attention to that around, are the foster parents receiving all the assistance that they need relative to this disabled kid? And that disability might be a physical disability, or it might be a mental, emotional kind of one there. So to make sure that kids are, their basic physical and mental health needs, their dental needs are actually being met in the way that a good parent would meet them. So we want foster child welfare systems to be an occasion of good parenting, not of questionable parenting, but of marginal parenting, but of really good parenting. And so the kind of things that we would routinely take for granted with our own kids and with our grandkids and our relatives, we want those things to happen for foster kids as well there. So let me stop there. Okay, let me just bring up a couple of other things here kind of quickly. So one of the things that I used to try to do, so I was a caseworker for 12 years, 7 years in Colorado, 5 or 6 years in Washington. And one of the things I used to try to do as a caseworker is that when kids were reunified with a birth parent or with birth parents after some period of time in care, and particularly if this child had a good relationship with a foster parent, which was frequently the case, then I would try to arrange a situation where the kid was able to maintain some degree of contact with a foster parent. At least I would organize a discussion, arrange a discussion of that particular subject between the birth parent and the foster parents and so forth, right? So I guess the reason I'm raising this is because it's just to say that when foster parents and birth parents had never had much contact, sometimes no contact, but very limited contact when kids were in foster care, whatever I said, that was just prior to reunification on this particular subject, it was in one ear and out the other. That is, there was never a time when I could make this happen. And so one of the things that I learned over time is that if foster parents and birth parents do not have ongoing contact when the child is in foster care, there is no chance that birth parent is going to maintain some kind of connection with that foster parent after the child returns home, no matter how tight, close that relationship is between the child and the foster parents. So that's one of the reasons to try to encourage and develop, whenever possible, some kind of positive kind of contact between foster parents and birth parents there. Because ideally, in the best situations, and I have to acknowledge this doesn't happen all that longer, but I've seen it happen from time to time. Sometimes foster parents can become a support system in the same way that extended family members can be extended supports for a birth parent after, for example, by providing emergency respite care. So that's another way, by the way, we can use foster care systems to support birth parents during the reunification process. So I'm going to say this, this is so to the subject of reunification here real quickly. When kids have gone back to birth parents, there's going to be a period, a lot of times of about a month or two, when sometimes there's a honeymoon phase here, sometimes there isn't. But after that, frequently the birth parent is going to struggle with behavior problem in the same way that foster parents struggle with kids' behavior problems. And so we can begin to think about and talk about, well, how can we use foster parents in that situation to actually support the birth parents after there has been a reunification? And sometimes I guess that's still called trial home visits for the first month or whatever that is, but also for a longer period of time there. As a way of preventing re-entry into care here. So let me stop here and see if you have comments or questions here. I still do want to say something briefly on behalf, just because I have the opportunity to say that this state, like other states, should actually be gradually developing a cadre of professional foster parents, even if all those foster parents were connected to private agencies, which I've already said they aren't. But even if they were, we would still want states as a public policy thing to be, so think about the number of kids in foster care and divide that by 20. And whatever that number is, we ought to be aiming about 5% of the foster care population. We need to be thinking about developing a cadre of professional foster parents for that 5%. Maybe it's a little bit more, sort of in that neighborhood kind of thing there. Because there are just some children within the foster care system that are just never going to be amenable to care by volunteers. And in past years, a lot of those kids, as I've already mentioned, end up in residential care systems. And sometimes, as I've already mentioned, that wasn't always the greatest experience. So again, as a public policy matter, we ought to be thinking about a cadre of professional foster parents. That's not the same thing as making foster care. That's not the same thing as professionalizing foster care in general. That's not what I'm advocating for here. And so sometimes when you end up with, I hear discussions of this in public policy forums and so forth, someone is kind of beating up a straw man here on the idea that we shouldn't be paying, foster parents for the care of kids, blah, blah, blah. And maybe a lot of times that's true. But for about 5% of the population, it's either that, or they're going to be in residential care facilities, or they're going to be in hotels, or they're going to be in some psychiatric institution, or something really bad is going to happen to them. So this is a state that in recent years has had the idea that one of the ways of reducing foster care is just don't invest in it. And that's an idea that people haven't been ballsy enough to assert out loud, but that's the meaning of the behavior. So we're now in a situation in this state where there have been such large foster care reductions, major league, that we ought to be thinking about, again, how do we improve foster care systems, not with the idea that we're going to go back to the old numbers, or anything like that, but how are we just going to make this a more beneficial experience in general for the kids in foster care systems? And one of those is we want to try to prevent those children who are moving from home to home to home 10, 20, 30, 40 times those kind of experiences. And to do that, we're going to need a professional cadre of foster parents. Now, I haven't said much about the kinship care parents, but I do want to say here just a little bit about that, because I think the Mockingbird hub model of the which has been around for now maybe over a 20-year period of time. I don't know the extent to which DCYF is at this point even investing in that model. But I think of all the models that I've seen, this idea of the hub home, of having half a dozen or more homes that are surround a hub home, and having hub foster parents that are available to provide respite care and other kind of supportive services. That was almost an ideal, not for the behaviorally troubled kids. A lot of times it wasn't adequate for them, but it was great for the kinship care families that had multiple siblings in them. So again, even for the sibling kind of idea, so a lot of times I think there's even an idea here that's not even asserted a lot of times openly, which is that we have kids in kinship care homes. We just don't have to provide those same kind of supports that we do if the kid's in a non-kinship care home or something. And just a lot of times that's just not true. So particularly if you have behaviorally troubled kids, I mean, the kinship care families are going to have the same trouble likely with handling the behavior problems as the non-kin foster, and they're going to need the same kind of supports there. And so again, going back to the idea of, to the extent that, I don't know the extent that those hub homes still exist around the state, but this is something that the state missed a golden opportunity to invest in this. For a number of reasons there, but anyway, sad. So let me see, we're at 12 o'clock. So let me stop here and see if you have comments or questions here. So I want to say one last thing here, which is that any system that wants to improve itself over time, and here I don't mean just the DCYF, but I mean all of us, courts, everyone who's involved with foster kids, if you want to do better at anything over some period of time, you have to really think about how you get some honest, candid feedback on what you're doing. And by you, I mean all of us, what all of us are doing. So the idea should be here is that particularly for the school age kids, and here I mean any child who's 6 to 17 or older, who exits foster care, you know, if they've had a stay of anywhere from 3 to 6 months, or a lot of times, obviously, much longer than that, and they're exiting the foster care system, someone should be sitting down with them on a routine basis to ask about their experiences in foster care. That ought to be something that states do routinely and would be doing routinely if there was a concern about the quality of foster care in this state. That's what an organization does that is concerned about doing a good job. It somehow elicits feedback on its performance. And it invites honest, open feedback. And here we're talking about honest, open feedback from the foster children, from the foster youth. And so there have been some, as I mentioned before, some really shocking studies here that have been done even in recent years by Chapin Hall and by some other entities in this country about what do adolescents say who have aged out of foster care systems when they are asked these questions. What kind of experience did you have in care? Were you ever harmed when you were in care? If so, who were you harmed by? Was there someone that you trusted that you believed in you? Did you have opportunities to do X, Y, and Z? When kids are asked those kind of questions, a lot of kids who've aged out of care, in some of these studies, a third to a half of these kids have been reported being abused or neglected in care, apart from all the other things that happened to them. So that's really shocking numbers. And this isn't necessarily reflective of the experiences of all kids in foster care, because again, we're talking about the teenagers, the kids who've been in foster care, particularly the older youth and so forth, right? Nevertheless, how could any foster care system be complacent with a situation where more than a third of the kids who are aging out of care say they've been abused or neglected in care? And granted that maybe some of those kids exaggerated, or maybe some of them even made it up, but probably a lot of them were just telling just the flat truth. So yeah, so we need to think about as a system, and I don't think this is necessarily on the CASA program, but it's something that insofar as all of us have conversations about how we improve foster care in this state, this would have to be a part of it. It would have to be, how do we obtain some kind of routine feedback, particularly at the time when foster kids are leaving the foster care system. And there are obviously ought to be questions about how can we do that in a way that would be non-threatening, comfortable, respectful. All that stuff would be true there. So I think I'll stop there, right?
Thank you so much, Dee, and look forward to your next training. This has been really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I don't know, March, I don't know how many Fridays March has. Do you have a calendar in front of you?
Sure do. Let's see. It'd be the 28th again.
Okay, the 28th then.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dee.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.